Ever since I was a kid, I knew I'd be helping people. Growing up, every time I patched up a scraped knee or helped soothe a fever, it felt right. I'm Anna, by the way. My journey into the medical world wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and I clung to it with everything I had. The university was my escape and my battlefield. I wasn't the top of my class, but I hustled hard. Nursing wasn't just a program, it was a ticket to making a real difference. And hell, I worked every angle, from grueling night shifts at the local clinic to volunteering at blood drives. Anything to build that resume and keep the scholarships coming. After getting my degree, I stayed in the city. The hospital gigs were fine, but something was missing. That's when I stumbled into cosmetology. It might not sound like life-saving stuff, but you'd be surprised how much a good skin day can mean to someone who's been battling acne or scars. I hustled some more, saved up, and eventually, with a chunky loan weighing down my bank account, I opened my own small office. It was just a tiny room in a shared space, but it was mine. It was at one of these rare gatherings with friends, you know, the kind where you realize you haven't seen each other in ages and everything just clicks, that I met David. He was a friend of a friend, typical setup. "So, you're like a nurse or something?" David asked, beer in hand, an easy smile on his face. Now I'm a cosmetologist. I own my place, I said, a little too defensively, expecting the usual judgment. "That's badass. Running your own show. Must be nice calling the shots," he said, genuinely impressed, not a hint of sarcasm. "Yeah, it's pretty cool." "Hard, but cool," I admitted, warming up to his interest. The night faded into a blur of laughter and music, but David's words stuck with me. He wasn't like the others who just nodded along. He got it, the grind, the passion. It was refreshing. Life before David was simple. Work, pay bills, hang out sometimes. But after that night, things changed. We started seeing each other, and every date, every late-night call, it just felt like, maybe, just maybe, I wasn't in this all alone anymore. Over the next few months, we found our rhythm. He'd text me in the morning, something goofy to start the day. I'd call him on my breaks, just hearing about his day made the hours easier. He worked in tech, something about networks, and a lot of complaining about how nobody appreciated good code. He met my friends, I met his. His mom, Mrs. Walker, took to me right away. She was a stout woman, strong in her opinions, and generous with her laughter. The first time I met her, she hugged me like we were long-lost family. "David hasn't shut up about you," she whispered in my ear. "About time he found someone who can keep up with him." We had dinner at her place one Sunday. It was all very casual, homemade lasagna, and stories about David's childhood. "He used to run around barefoot all summer," she laughed, said shoes made him slow. David blushed, tried to change the subject. "Mom, come on, don't embarrass me." "Oh, hush, let her see you're not as cool as you pretend," Mrs. Walker teased, and we all laughed. It was easy, comfortable. It felt right, being there with them. After about a year, things got serious. We were spending almost every night together, and not just at my place. One chilly evening, wrapped up in blankets on my tiny balcony, David broke the silence. "Anna, I've been thinking about us." I tensed, uncertain. "Yeah? What about us?" He took a deep breath, his hand finding mine under the blanket. I know I want to build something with you. A real life. What do you think?" My heart raced, but I played it cool. "Build something, huh? Like Lego or more a Monopoly kind of deal?" He chuckled, squeezing my hand. "Funny. I mean a life, Anna. Together. Maybe even think about getting a place, something permanent." The idea was terrifying and exciting all at once. "I'd like that," I admitted. A lot. So, we started planning, dreaming really. It wasn't just about moving in or the next few years. We talked about everything, kids, careers, buying a house. He proposed not long after that night, nothing fancy, just us, which was perfect. Marry me, Anna. Let's do this for real. In a small, candlelit room, with the curtains drawn and rain tapping softly against the window, I said yes. It was the easiest yes I've ever said. The wedding planning started soon after. Mrs. Walker was a godsend, knowing just who to call, what to book, making it all seem easy. You just worry about being happy, I'll handle the stress, she insisted, and I let her, grateful for her support. It was simple, but perfect. A small ceremony, our closest friends and family, and an air of hope around us. As I walked down the aisle, seeing David there, waiting, I felt like everything was falling into place. He grinned, that lopsided grin that made me fall for him, and I knew, no matter what came our way, we'd handle it. Together. David moved into my apartment, the one I'd been renting since my cosmetologist days were just a dream. We unpacked, merged our books and dishes, and figured out whose art got wall space. It was cozy, happy chaos. The first few weeks, we'd sit at the little dining table with our laptops and piles of bills, making budgets like some kind of grown-up team. I'll handle the groceries and utilities, David offered one evening, his eyes serious as he typed out a spreadsheet. I nodded, scribbling on a notepad. And I'll keep smashing at this loan. The sooner it's gone, the sooner we can think about a house. And, maybe kids. Even saying it felt big, full of possibilities. David smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Sounds like a plan, babe. Everything seemed lined up just right. But then, things with Mrs. Walker shifted. She'd been like a second mom during the wedding prep, but suddenly, I was out of the circle. No more Sunday dinners, no calls. When I asked David about it, he'd shrug, looking uncomfortable. She's got her moods, Her health isn't great these days. Maybe give her some space, he suggested one night when I brought it up after another missed call. I wanted to dig deeper, but the wall in his eyes told me to leave it. So, I dropped it. Maybe it was easier, not pushing. A year into our marriage, though, another crack appeared. David's steady support began to wane. Bills piled up on my desk, and his contributions dwindled to nothing. I found myself covering everything, from rent to the electric bill. Babe, what's going on? I finally confronted him one evening, bills in hand. This is the third month you've not chipped in. David looked away, tension in his jaw. It's my mom. She's really sick, Anna. Hospital bills, medications, it's a lot. I've had to help out. Okay, I get family first, but we're supposed to be a team. You should have said something, I snapped, feeling both worried and betrayed. I know. I'm sorry, babe. Just, can you handle things for a bit longer? I'll make it up to you, I promise. His voice was earnest, pleading. So, I tightened our belts. I called my parents, hating every minute of it. Mom, Dad, I hate to ask, but could you help out a little this month? Just until we get back on our feet. They said what they could, never asking if David was pulling his weight. I didn't have the heart to tell them he wasn't. Work became my refuge and my prison. I skipped lunches, booked clients back to back. Sundays off became a memory. I barely saw David, he was either at work or helping his mom. Our apartment felt too big without him, the silence too loud. One rare evening together, I tried to bridge the gap. We're in this together, right? Tell me what's going on, really. David, looking worn and thin, just shook his head. It's just really bad right now. Mom's fading, and I can't think beyond that. I nodded, swallowing my frustration. Okay, but remember, I'm here. We're supposed to do this together. Over a year had passed since David started shifting all his financial responsibilities onto me. Meanwhile, I managed to pay off the loan from my office. Finally, that tiny room was all mine, every inch a testament to the sweat and late nights I'd poured into it. But as my professional dreams solidified, my personal life with David crumbled. Money, or the lack of it, became a constant shadow over us. He'd promised things would get better once he took on a second job, but if anything, they got worse. David was never home, and the few bucks he contributed might as well have been pennies thrown into a well. One night, when I heard the door creak open way past midnight, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I sat at the kitchen table, bills and overdue notices spread out like a deck of bad luck. "David," I started, my voice tight. "We need to talk. This," I waved at the pile, "isn't sustainable." He sighed, a deep, weary sound, and sank into the chair opposite me. He looked as run down as I felt. "I know it's tough, Anna, but I'm doing everything I can. Mom's bills are they're killing me." "And what about us? Our bills?" I shot back, frustration spiking. "When is it going to be enough, David?" David looked at me, really looked, and for a second, I thought he might finally understand. But then he dropped the bomb. Maybe we could sell your office? Just until things stabilize. It would give us some breathing room." I stared at him, disbelief and anger swirling into a nasty knot in my stomach. "Sell my office? My dream? That's your solution?" I stood up, pushing my chair back so hard it screeched against the tile. David flinched, but pushed on. "It's just until we get back on our feet. I'm out there busting my ass every day and night, Anna." "And what? You think I'm not?" My voice rose, sharp and raw. "I built that business from nothing while paying half our bills on my own. And you want me to just give it up?" He stood too, anger flashing in his eyes. "Then what do you want me to do? Huh? Let my mother starve? That's not fair, and you know it." I was yelling now, too far gone to care about keeping it together. "I want a partner, David, not just a roommate who leaves me to handle everything alone." We glared at each other, the air between us thick with unsaid things and regrets. Finally, David turned and walked away, the conversation unresolved, leaving me standing there, feeling more alone than ever. Our fights became frequent, each one chipping away at what was left of our marriage. Every discussion about money ended in raised voices and slammed doors. I began to wonder if the man I married was still there, somewhere beneath the stress and the desperation. It was an unusually quiet Tuesday when I decided to head home early after a client canceled last minute. I wasn't too upset about it, the extra time gave me a chance to catch up on some much-needed rest. Pushing open the door to our apartment, I was surprised to find David frantically ironing his black suit, the one he only wore to weddings or funerals. The sight stopped me dead in my tracks. "David, what's going on? Why are you all dressed up like that?" My voice echoed slightly in the hallway, tinged with confusion. He jumped a little, clearly not expecting me. His face went pale, then flushed, a clear sign he was nervous. "It's my mom, Anna. She passed away last night. There's the funeral tomorrow." The news hit like a sucker punch. Despite everything, Mrs. Walker had been like family to me once. "Oh, David, I'm so sorry. I'll come with you, of course." "No." His response was sharp, slicing the air. She didn't want you there, Anna. Her last request. She said she never really liked you." His words were blunt, cold even. I recoiled as if slapped, my heart thumping painfully in my chest. Okay. If that's her wish." It hurt, more than I expected, but I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded, stepping away to hide the hurt. David didn't say anything more. He just went back to his ironing, leaving me standing there, a mix of grief and confusion swirling inside me. That night, I lay in bed, thoughts racing. Something didn't sit right with me. Mrs. Walker and I had our differences, but this seemed too harsh even for her. The next morning, I watched from the window as David left, dressed in his suit, looking every part the grieving son. Once he was gone, I made a decision. I rescheduled my appointments and drove to Mrs. Walker's house, expecting to find a gathering of some sort, maybe just the tail end of it. But the street was quiet. Too quiet. Her house looked just like any other day, no cars lined up outside, no signs of a wake. Confusion led me to the front door, and on impulse, I rang the bell. The door swung open, and there she was, Mrs. Walker, very much alive, staring back at me with wide eyes. My heart stopped, then started at a sprint. You're alive?" She took a step back, her own face a mask of shock. "Anna? What on earth, why would you think otherwise?" David told me you were," the words tangled in my throat, too surreal to voice fully. "Dead?" She finished for me, her brow furrowing in confusion and concern. "My God, no. Come in, Anna. We need to sort this out." Numbly, I stepped inside, the familiar smells of her home wrapping around me like a bewildering comfort. We sat at her kitchen table, the same place we'd shared many cups of coffee. "I don't understand." "He said there was a funeral today. He was so upset." My voice trailed off as I pulled out my phone, the need to confront David growing urgent. But just as I was about to dial, my phone buzzed with a notification. David had started a live stream on Instagram. Curiosity overpowered everything else, and I clicked the link, my fingers trembling. There was a live broadcast of the funeral. But who was in the coffin if David's mother was sitting next to me? We needed to find out the truth, so we went to the funeral, finding out the exact address in one of the comments. As we drove, I couldn't help but replay the last few years in my mind, trying to piece together the deception. "So, he told you I didn't want to see you?" I asked, turning to look at her as she focused on the road. "Yes, and I believed him. And all this time, I was sending him money because he told me you were struggling with debt, that creditors were after you," Mrs. Walker explained, her voice tinged with hurt. I shook my head, feeling the weight of missed connections. "That's not true. He told me you were sick, and that you didn't want anything to do with me. He said visiting would stress you out. He's been lying to both of us, playing us against each other." We drove in silence for a while, each lost in our thoughts, until we reached the cemetery. It looked exactly like you'd expect a place of mourning to look, somber, quiet, with people dressed in black milling about. We parked a little distance away, not wanting to draw attention to ourselves. As we approached, we stayed on the fringes, close enough to hear, but far enough to remain unnoticed. I spotted David, standing beside a grave with a group of people I didn't recognize. They were all consoling him. Curious and cautious, we edged closer to some of the attendees who looked less involved. Mrs. Walker nudged me, and I cleared my throat before speaking to a somber-faced woman standing nearby. "Excuse me, I'm so sorry for your loss. We just heard and came as soon as we could. May I ask who passed away?" I kept my voice low, respectful. The woman looked at us with sad eyes. "Oh, thank you. It's my niece, poor thing. She fought long and hard against her illness. A year of marriage and now this tragedy." My heart stuttered. "Your niece was married too?" She nodded toward David. "Yes, to that young man there. They were so in love. Heartbreaking." The pieces clicked, each one a betrayal. I felt Mrs. Walker stiffen beside me, her breath catching. "He's been living a double life," I said, the words tasting foul in my mouth. Mrs. Walker covered her face with her hands briefly, before looking at me, her eyes fierce. "We can't let him get away with this. Not only has he lied and cheated, but he's also played us for fools. Let the funeral end, see where he goes, who he talks to." So, we waited, hidden in plain sight among the mourners, watching as David played the grieving husband. It was a performance worthy of an award, and under different circumstances, I might have applauded the sheer audacity of his deceit. After the funeral, Mrs. Walker and I slipped into her car, keeping a low profile as we trailed behind David and the grieving parents of the woman he claimed to love. They drove to a large, beautiful house, its door standing open. We parked a bit away and walked up quietly, unnoticed in the chaos of guests and condolences. Stepping into the house, the murmur of voices from the living room guided us. We hovered just out of sight, catching the tail end of a conversation that made my blood run cold. "He's like a son to us now," the deceased woman's father was saying, his voice thick with emotion. And we've decided, in light of our daughter's passing, to leave him everything, the house, our business. It's what she would have wanted. David's response was choked, a sob breaking through. Thank you. I've lost my parents years ago, and having a family again means everything to me. Suddenly, Mrs. Walker couldn't contain herself any longer. She burst into the room, her voice a sharp crack in the solemn atmosphere. When exactly did I die, David? The room fell silent, all eyes snapping to where we stood. David's face went from grief-stricken to ghostly pale, his eyes wide with shock. I followed Mrs. Walker in, my own anger bubbling over. Yeah, David, what's going on? How could you marry again? Did you forget you already have a wife? The parents of the deceased woman looked from me to David, confusion turning to horror. What is she talking about, David? Married? To her? David stammered, his earlier composure crumbling under the weight of his lies. It's not like that. I can explain. Explain? Explain how you've been lying to us all this time? The father's voice boomed, his initial kindness curdling into fury. David's desperation was palpable as he turned to the parents. Please, you have to understand, I was going to fix everything. Mrs. Walker snorted, disbelief and anger etching her features. By faking your mother's death? By marrying another woman while your wife is still around? David looked at me then, his eyes pleading. Anna, I'm sorry. I got into some trouble, some really bad debts with dangerous people. I thought I could fix it before it got out of hand. The deceased woman's mother finally found her voice, her grief morphing into outrage. Get out of our house. We will be calling our lawyers. You will give back every single penny. On the front lawn, as David was escorted out by the father, Mrs. Walker turned to him, her voice cutting through the crisp air. I don't ever want to see you again. You are no son of mine. David collapsed to his knees on the pavement, crying out, Please, don't leave me like this. They'll kill me. I just need a chance to make things right. I watched, numb, as he reached for us, his tears leaving trails on his cheeks. But there was nothing left to say. I turned away, the final shred of any affection I might have had for him withering in the harsh light of his deceit. The morning after David's deception unraveled before the world, I was sitting across from my lawyer, a steely-eyed woman named Sharon who had come highly recommended. So, you're telling me he forged my signature on divorce papers? I asked, still grappling with the breadth of David's betrayal. Sharon nodded, her lips a thin line. Exactly. And it was this forgery that allowed him to marry again legally. We've got a clear case for fraud. By the afternoon, I was at the police station, recounting everything to a sympathetic officer who promised they'd take it seriously. True to their word, the wheels of justice spun faster than I'd expected. David was conditionally convicted of document forgery within weeks. During this whirlwind, I also demanded financial restitution for the years I'd unwittingly supported his double life. Between my claims and the lawsuit filed by the parents of his second, late wife, David's facade of a successful, if secretive, life crumbled spectacularly. He did pay, both financially and morally. With his assets liquidated to cover the settlements and his reputation in tatters, David fled the country, chased by the debt still snapping at his heels. With the money I received, I poured my energy into expanding my cosmetology office. New equipment, a fresh coat of paint, and 2 new hires later, it felt like I was finally rebuilding from the ruins David had left behind. In the midst of the chaos, a new, unexpected chapter of my life began. I discovered I was pregnant. The news brought a whirlwind of emotions, fear and joy inextricably linked. But when Mrs. Walker heard, her reaction was nothing but supportive. Anna, this is wonderful news. Say you'll let me help, let me be a part of this child's life. Heaven knows, after everything with David, I need something good to focus on. She assured me over the phone, her voice warm and unwavering. Mrs. Walker not only supported me but went so far as to include me and my future child in her will, making us her sole heirs. It was more than I could have ever expected, and it solidified our bond, forged not by blood but by shared trials. We often spent afternoons together, planning for the future, discussing how we'd decorate the nursery, and talking about what we'd teach the little one. The betrayal that had brought so much pain had also brought unexpected gifts, and I found solace in that silver lining.